It begins with a single sheet of paper, yellowed by time, tucked into the forgotten corner of an archive that no one was supposed to open. On it, a sketch complex, precise, and unsettling, the kind of diagram that seems at once ingenious and forbidden. Those who stumbled across it claimed it wasn't just an idea. It was a warning disguised as a blueprint. At the top, in faint pencil, 3 words had been scrawled in hurried strokes. Do not build. That phrase alone was enough to spark rumors. For decades, engineers whispered about the so-called shadow design, a machine theorized to harness forces that human hands were never meant to control. Unlike most blueprints, which belonged to inventors hungry for recognition, this one bore no name, no patent, no official record, just scattered references in obscure engineering journals from the mid-20th century, footnotes so brief they felt almost accidental, as if someone had tried to erase the memory of its existence, but hadn't been entirely successful. The fragments that remained painted a strange picture. Some claimed the machine was capable of tapping into a natural resonance of the earth itself. Others insisted it was a weapon, designed not to destroy cities, but to unmake the very stability of matter. A few even whispered that the design wasn't entirely human in origin, that it had appeared anonymously mailed to certain universities, as if testing whether anyone would dare to solve it. But what made the story even more chilling was the silence. In an age when scientists eagerly published their discoveries, the blueprint generated almost nothing. No public discussion, no debates, no grandiose theories. Just sudden gaps in academic conversations, journals abruptly ending certain topics, and conferences where entire lectures were struck from the record. The absence spoke louder than words. Something had been buried deliberately. Tracing the origins of the design is like following shadows in a maze. The earliest references appeared in the late 1940s, during a time when the world was still grappling with the raw horror of nuclear fire. Engineers, mathematicians, and physicists were experimenting with ideas that reached beyond what was considered safe or even rational. It was an era of both ambition and paranoia-perfect conditions for dangerous brilliance to slip through unnoticed. One particularly unsettling reference appeared in a 1952 engineering bulletin, tucked within an article about power systems. A single paragraph alluded to resonant structures unsuitable for applied construction due to uncontrollable harmonics. In the 1960s, the trail grew colder, but stranger. A retired electrical engineer claimed in a private letter later uncovered in an estate auction that he had once been shown a partial draft of the blueprint. According to his description, the device used geometric alignments that mirrored planetary ratios, almost like it was tuned to cosmic patterns rather than earthly mechanics. He admitted he hadn't understood it fully. What unsettled him most was not the design itself, but the reaction of his colleague who shared it with him. A man had been visibly shaken, insisting the papers had to be burned, that no one should ever attempt construction. The mystery deepened when fragments of the design began circulating quietly among amateur researchers in the 1980s. Photocopies, always incomplete, began appearing in underground newsletters devoted to fringe science. Each version was slightly different, as though deliberately altered, ensuring no one person ever had the whole picture. Still, the same 3 words always hovered in the margins. Do not build. Why would someone go to such lengths to conceal an invention rather than pursue its promise? History is filled with suppressed designs, but usually they are hidden for economic or political reasons. This, however, felt different. It wasn't a matter of patents or competition. It felt like a warning, not just to rivals, but to humanity itself. A secret whispered not for profit, but for survival. The sheer persistence of the rumors suggests something real was at the heart of it. Too many independent sources, across too many decades, speak of the same elusive blueprint. Some claimed it drew from Nikola Tesla's more obscure experiments, ideas about vibrations and energy that mainstream science dismissed as impractical. Others connected it to classified military projects, abandoned after tests produced effects no one could explain. Still others believed it had roots much older encoded within ancient diagrams, disguised as sacred geometry long before modern engineering existed. But perhaps the most unsettling piece of the puzzle lies in what came after. Those who attempted to reconstruct even portions of the blueprint often described eerie outcomes. Small test rigs that seemed to generate inexplicable fields. Devices that hummed with an energy disproportionate to their size. Instances where machinery behaved unpredictably, as though tapping into forces unmeasured by standard instruments. These reports were scattered, anecdotal, always missing the technical details required to replicate them. But the consistency of the accounts, the unease, the warnings, the abrupt endings, echoed the same refrain. This was not a design to be completed. The legend of the shadow blueprint endures because it touches on something deeper than technology. It forces us to confront a question humanity rarely asks until it's too late. Are there inventions we are not meant to create? The atomic bomb was once a blueprint too, just lines on paper before it became fire and ash. The shadow blueprint carries that same aura of dread, but without the clarity of purpose. No government admitted to owning it. No scientist claimed it. It was as if the idea itself resisted ownership, lingering like a ghost in the margins of human ambition. And so the paper waits, perhaps lost in an archive, perhaps locked away in a private collection, perhaps destroyed, but remembered in whispers. Its details remain elusive, scattered across decades, half erased by deliberate hands. But its warning, faint as pencil on yellowed paper, still chills those who hear of it. Do not build. For some, that phrase is enough to dismiss it as a hoax, the kind of legend that thrives on mystery more than substance. For others, it is precisely the absence of clarity that makes it believable. Because history has shown us again and again that the most dangerous creations often begin in silence, in secrecy, in the corners of archives where no one was supposed to look. The shadow blueprint stands as a haunting threshold. Whether it was real or imagined, its legend tells us something undeniable. Knowledge is never neutral. Every line drawn on paper holds the potential to shape the world, or to unmake it. And somewhere, in the fragile folds of a forgotten page, may lie the echo of a design too dangerous to ever see the light of day. The story of the Forbidden's invention begins not with thunder or spectacle, but with silence. A silence so dense it was said to hang over the workshop like a veil, broken only by the scrape of pen against paper, the hiss of steam, or the low hum of gears turning where they should not have turned. What the inventor had envisioned was nothing less than the bending of natural law itself. A machine that did not merely extend human capability, but threatened to redefine what it meant to be human. Unlike the practical engines of industry, this was not meant to plow fields or power lamps. It was designed to touch the very essence of existence, to seize control of forces long believed untouchable. The records that survive are fragmentary, whispered accounts scattered in journals and suppressed archives, but they all carry the same undercurrent of awe. The invention was said to collapse distances, to make impossibilities within reach, to bridge gaps between thought and matter. Some spoke of it as a mirror that obeys, reflecting not what was, but what could be, bending time, memory, or matter to the command of the one who wielded it. Others claimed it was a device of pure energy, a lattice of metals and magnetism capable of tearing open what should remain closed. Yet what made it forbidden's was not the brilliance of its design, but the cost that came with it. To operate, it required sacrifices invisible to the eye. It consumed more than fuel or material. It drained vitality, attention, perhaps even fragments of the human soul. Witnesses described those who worked near it as hollowed, their eyes ringed with shadows, their laughter absent, their days stretched thin like parchment about to tear. The closer they came to success, the more they seemed to unravel. Still, the inventor pressed on, convinced that the discovery was worth any risk. Genius often finds itself tethered to obsession, and here, obsession transformed into a kind of fever. Pages of notes multiplied into volumes. Sketches piled upon sketches, each iteration more complex than the last, until even fellow engineers could no longer decipher the diagrams. To outsiders, the workshop became a shrine to madness. To the inventor, it was the threshold of immortality. And there lies the duality that makes this invention so haunting. On one hand, it promised a future beyond comprehension, instantaneous travel across vast distances, limitless energy, or perhaps even communication across the veil of death itself. On the other hand, it threatened to dissolve the fragile fabric of reality that holds everything together. There is a reason most great civilizations feared unchecked knowledge. They understood that progress without restraint does not always lead to enlightenment. Sometimes it leads to ruin. Ancient myths warned of Icarus and his wings, of Prometheus and the fire he dared to steal. The Forbidden's invention was a modern echo of those warnings, a reminder that ambition and catastrophe often share the same blueprint. What makes this story so compelling is how close it came to completion. Witnesses swore the device flickered to life, glowing with a pale, unnatural light. Metal plates resonated with a frequency no ear could comfortably bear. Some claimed shadows in the room stretched and warped, as if resisting the pull of unseen gravity. The invention was no longer an idea scribbled on parchment. It was real, and it was awake. But the awakening came with consequences. Strange illnesses spread among those who assisted in its construction. Machinery elsewhere in the building malfunctioned as if disturbed by invisible interference. Dogs howled in the streets at night, long before any sound could reach them. And above all, the inventor himself began to change. His words became erratic, his writings increasingly cryptic. In moments of clarity, he confessed that the invention did not belong to him at all, that he was not the creator, only the vessel. No record confirms exactly what happened on the final night the machine was tested. Some say there was a blinding flash, followed by an explosion that reduced the workshop to rubble. Others whisper that the device simply vanished, as though it had folded itself out of existence, leaving behind only scorch marks on the floor and the scent of ozone in the air. What is certain is that the invention was never seen again. Authorities erased references to it, archives sealed documents, and whispers of its capabilities faded into myth. And yet, fragments endure, tantalizing hints scattered through history. A drawing smuggled into a private collection. A letter warning of the machine that should not be built. A rumor of foreign governments attempting to reconstruct it in secret laboratories. All incomplete, all inconclusive, yet together forming a mosaic of something too powerful to fully erase. The Forbidden's invention reminds us of the fragile line between genius and folly. It shows how innovation can inspire both awe and dread, how the very pursuit of progress can pull humanity toward a precipice. Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it lies hidden in some forgotten chamber, waiting for the right hands or the wrong ones to bring it back to life. What lingers is the lesson. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Records suggest that the first prototype was not built in a prestigious laboratory, nor under the spotlight of official research. Instead, it took shape in the shadows of a forgotten industrial facility, a place where dust and rust masked decades of silence. Here, behind locked steel doors and windows sealed with iron plating, engineers gathered under contracts that forbade them from ever speaking of what they were about to create. The project was born not from pure science, but from obsession. Rumors suggest that those involved were handpicked not for their expertise alone, but for their willingness to push the limits of sanity. Men and women who had worked in nuclear plants, high-voltage research labs, and psychological war divisions found themselves summoned into a program that officially did not exist. They were told only one thing: What they were building could change everything humanity knew about reality itself. It began with simple components: coils, magnets, and copper wound with mathematical precision. But as the structure grew, it began to resemble something far stranger than any machine. Witnesses described it not as a piece of technology, but as a living skeleton of iron, as though the framework had an unnatural symmetry and intelligence in its very design. Some even claimed that the blueprints themselves seemed wrong, geometries bending at impossible angles, diagrams that shifted meaning when viewed twice. The first attempt at activation was scheduled in the dead of night. According to surviving documents, power was drawn from an entire grid substation, rerouted into the machine's coils. As the current surged, lights across the city district flickered. In the control chamber, engineers watched gauges spin into the red. Then the atmosphere shifted. A hum began to crawl through the walls, low and bone-deep, vibrating through the very air until it seemed the entire facility was breathing. That was when the malfunctions began. Monitors cracked from the inside out, glass splitting like ice under strain. Machinery ground against itself, gears reversing without any command. Sparks burst from wires that hadn't been connected to power sources. Several witnesses described lights dimming, not like a blackout, but as if the very concept of illumination was being drained away. The room grew darker, even though electricity continued to flow. And then came the surge. A pulse of energy rippled outward, knocking several workers to the floor. Records say the air itself shimmered, like heat rising from asphalt. For a moment, the machine glowed with an unnatural brilliance, a white-blue aura that illuminated the entire hall. Those who saw it claimed it wasn't light in the traditional sense. It had weight. It pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating, as though visibility had become a physical force. Moments later, silence. The prototype collapsed inward, its coils twisted like melted wax. Metal beams bent at perfect right angles, as though softened and sculpted by invisible hands. When investigators returned to catalog the wreckage, they found something else. Tools had fused to the concrete floor. Wrenches were discovered embedded halfway into steel plates, as if matter itself had briefly forgotten its own rules. The engineers who oversaw the attempt were never seen again in public records. Some suggest they were relocated, others that they vanished entirely. But whispers among surviving staff spoke of breakdowns, sudden illnesses, and minds unraveling. One technician was found wandering the industrial yard days later, muttering endlessly about the eyes inside the machine. Another scratched incomprehensible formulas into walls until his hands bled, formulas that, when later examined, contained mathematics not yet published by mainstream science. Despite the disaster, the project did not end. If anything, the failure fueled further obsession. High-level memos described the test not as a catastrophe, but as a successful deviation, proof that the device had interacted with forces beyond the reach of conventional engineering. Whatever had occurred that night, the blackouts, the distortions, the strange energy field, it was considered evidence that they were on the right path, but others disagreed. Private letters from staff tell a different story, one of growing dread. Some wrote that they could no longer sleep near the machine's remains, claiming it emitted faint noises even when dismantled. A steady whisper, like radio static, leaking from behind walls. Others spoke of seeing shadows that bent against the light, forms that loomed behind them in reflective surfaces, vanishing the instant they turned their heads. Eventually, the facility itself was abandoned, locked, sealed, and quietly erased from official maps. Yet urban explorers who claim to have found its ruins report disturbing remnants. Rusted coils still humming faintly when approached with metal objects. Scorch marks across the walls, shaped not like fire damage, but like imprints of human figures burned into the steel. And graffiti left by unknown trespassers. Single words scrawled again and again. It remembers. Whether the first attempt was a genuine failure or a hidden success remains debated. But what cannot be denied is the impact it left on those who encountered it. Something in that chamber bent the rules of electricity, matter, and perhaps even thought. Something not fully mechanical, not entirely physical, and certainly not human. And as history would later reveal, the first attempt was never meant to be the last. The disappearance of the facility is more than just a story about a building. It is the story of how reality can be rewritten in front of our eyes, leaving only whispers where once there was industry, noise, and life. The plant was said to have been active for years, producing under the guise of harmless research, yet its sudden closure carried the weight of a calculated erasure. One night, the gates were locked, the lights went out, and the next morning, the world woke up to find nothing but silence. Former employees tell fragments of the tale. Some remember being called into last-minute meetings where contracts were shredded in front of them, where supervisors handed out strict non-disclosure agreements in exchange for silence. Others describe entire floors emptied within hours, heavy machines dismantled, and driven away in convoys that never returned. It was as though the building had been hollowed out, leaving only the shell of a structure already condemned to vanish. But the strangest part is what followed. Maps that once clearly marked the facility's coordinates began to omit it. Road signs that directed travelers toward it were taken down, replaced overnight as though the place had never existed. Government registries erased its business records, leaving behind inconsistencies in archives that once acknowledged it. In libraries and municipal offices, whole sections of documents were pulled from shelves. What remained were torn pages, misfiled references, and the vague memory of something that could no longer be proven. Those who lived nearby claimed that trucks carried more than machinery. Some swore the vehicles left under armed guard, with crates so large they could only have been moving classified equipment or dangerous material. Others believe human cargo was involved, that not all workers made it home that final night. Whichever version one listens to, all accounts converge on the same unsettling theme. People, objects, and truths were removed as if swallowed by the earth itself. And yet, not everything could be erased. Photographs linger in private albums, snapshots of workers in front of the gates, family gatherings near the facility's perimeter. In some cases, satellite images from older archives still reveal the outline of the plant before digital layers were revised. These remnants form a trail of ghosts, pieces of evidence clashing with the official claim that there was never a facility at all. The deliberate destruction of evidence suggests more than simple abandonment. If the building were useless, it would have been left to rot, repurposed, or demolished publicly. Instead, the systematic removal of its very memory indicates fear of discovery, fear of questions, fear that someone might notice too much. This is not how ordinary industries close. This is how secrets are buried. Over time, stories about the facility began to blend into myth. Some claimed that beneath its foundation lay an underground wing, sealed off and left intact, holding dangerous experiments that could never see daylight. Others whispered that the entire structure had been dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere under a different name, its identity camouflaged in plain sight. The most unnerving rumor of all suggested that the site was erased not to hide what had been done, but to hide what had gone wrong, something that escaped containment, something that could not be explained. The longer the silence endured, the more the absence itself became suspicious. Why were there no official demolition records? No land deeds? No property transfers? Why did neighboring companies that once referenced the facility in their documentation suddenly revise their histories, editing the plant out of shared projects? These gaps leave a pattern that is harder to ignore than any direct admission of guilt. Those who search for the truth find themselves staring at contradictions. Old maps contradict new ones. Employee testimonies contradict official denials. Even the ground where the facility once stood seems unsettled, layers of soil disturbed in ways that do not match ordinary construction or demolition. It is as if the earth itself bears the scar of a structure erased too quickly, too forcefully, without care for what traces might remain. And so, the vanishing facility stands as a paradox. It is a place that no longer exists, and yet its absence speaks louder than its presence ever did. Every erased file, every missing document, every silenced worker tells a story not of a forgotten building, but of a deliberate campaign to remove it from memory. What demands such secrecy? What justifies rewriting reality so completely that even the idea of the facility becomes a forbidden subject? The answer is buried somewhere in those missing crates, in the silenced voices, in the scarred land where maps no longer dare to mark the truth. For now, all we are left with is a vanishing act of terrifying precision, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous things are not the ones we see, but the ones someone desperately wants us to forget. Years later, long after the official project was declared closed, something unexpected surfaced. A box of worn, leather-bound notebooks handwritten in neat, meticulous lines was discovered in the possession of a retired engineer. To the untrained eye, they seemed like the musings of an aging man clinging to past work. But to those who studied them closely, the pages revealed something far stranger. Inside, he described experiments that had never been documented in official reports. He wrote about unstable energy fields surrounding the machine, waves that seemed to hum with a resonance beyond human hearing. He claimed these vibrations didn't just shake the walls, they bent perception itself. Workers near the core spoke of minutes stretching into hours and of hours collapsing into moments. Time, within a narrow radius of the device, seemed to fracture. One entry described a technician who vanished for a fraction of a second, as if his body had glitched in and out of reality. He faded, the engineer wrote, like a poor signal on an old television screen. And when he returned, he swore he had seen nothing but a gray void, where sound was hollow and motion was impossible. Other notes spoke of animals refusing to go near the machine. Birds would not perch on the facility roof. Dogs that once accompanied workers barked wildly at the humming chambers, their fur bristling as if they sensed something that human eyes could not. On one occasion, a flock of starlings fell dead mid-flight above the facility, dropping like stones the instant the machine roared to life. But perhaps most chilling of all were the entries about memory. Several staff members complained that their recollections of test days were slipping away. Entire afternoons seemed erased, conversations forgotten, hours lost as if stolen. One man claimed he walked out of the control room only to find himself standing in his kitchen at home, with no idea how he had arrived there. The engineer, cautious and methodical in his phrasing, never made sweeping conclusions. Instead, he left fragments, observations, and carefully drawn diagrams of fields and frequencies that seemed to vibrate just outside the known spectrum. He wrote of harmonic distortions and resonant gateways, terms that, in retrospect, carry an eerie implication. What was this machine really built to do? The official explanation claimed it was a simple industrial experiment, an attempt to harness energy more efficiently. But the notebooks painted a darker picture, a device that scraped against the fabric of reality itself, leaving scars no one could fully comprehend. The final pages were the most haunting. They spoke of meetings behind closed doors, of supervisors demanding silence, and of warnings that no trace of this is to leave the facility. He wrote of his own unease, confessing that he feared the experiments had not been halted, merely hidden. He hinted at other sites, other machines, and a network of projects operating under the cloak of secrecy. One line was underlined twice in red ink. If they ever perfect resonance, they will not open a door. They will tear the wall itself. To some, these journals are nothing more than the ramblings of an old man haunted by his career. To others, they are the missing puzzle pieces of a mystery deliberately buried by time. Either way, the notes reignited speculation, drawing new eyes to a story the world was never meant to revisit. And as the pages circulated among researchers, whispers grew louder. What if the project had never truly ended? What if the machine, or something far worse, was still humming in the shadows, bending time and memory in ways no one could control? They said the machine had been dismantled, scattered, and forgotten. But forgotten things have a way of clawing themselves back into history. It began as whispers dismissed at first as conspiracy chatter. A fragment here, a fragment there. Nothing dangerous on its own. A coil of copper too intricate for its time. A gear etched with markings that did not belong to any known manufacturer. A glass tube sealed with a residue no laboratory could identify. Each relic, found in isolation, told no story. Yet together, they spelled the return of something the world had sworn to erase. The first sighting emerged in the underground black markets of Eastern Europe. A nameless trader offered what he claimed was a prototype component from an unregistered Cold War experiment. At first, it was treated as a novelty, a curiosity to be haggled over, but those who saw it up close spoke of a hum that seemed to linger even after the piece was set down. Buyers vanished, sellers stopped answering their phones, and the artifact moved again, always into darker hands. Then came the abandoned warehouses. Urban explorers searching for forgotten relics of industry stumbled across crates left unmarked, hidden behind rusted machinery. Inside, they found objects wrapped in decaying cloth, stamped with codes that no one could trace. The explorers posted pictures online grainy, half-lit, tinged with disbelief. Within days, the posts were deleted. Accounts shut down. Some claimed the explorers themselves were approached, questioned, and warned. Whether by officials or by something less definable, no one could say. And still, the pieces kept turning up. A museum in South America quietly displayed a strange mechanism under the label, Unidentified Instrument, 19th Century. Experts who saw it noted that the alloys used were far too modern, far too advanced to fit the description. Visitors felt uneasy standing near it, reporting headaches, flashes of light, even distorted memories of places they'd never been. Yet the museum refused to remove it, insisting it was harmless. After all, to them it was nothing but metal and glass. But rumors spread that collectors had begun acquiring these parts, assembling them in secret. A photograph leaked blurry, perhaps deliberately so, showing three components aligned together on a steel table. The shapes matched perfectly, as if meant to lock into one another with an almost biological precision. That image, circulating through encrypted forums, became a beacon for those obsessed with the machine's return. Some sought it for power, others for knowledge, and a few simply out of terror that if no one controlled it, it would control itself. Academics, too, began to whisper. A professor in Prague claimed to have translated partial notes left by one of the machine's original engineers. The notes did not describe a machine in terms of power or weaponry. Instead, they spoke of resonance, of harmonics, of an ability to manipulate frequencies buried deep within both matter and the human mind. The fragments implied that once activated, the machine could not simply be turned off. It would keep moving, adjusting, evolving, as if it possessed a will tethered to law science had not yet written. Still, skeptics laughed. They dismissed the claims as recycled folklore, the kind of myth that always trails behind secret experiments. But the skeptics did not explain why governments seemed to react so quietly, so cautiously. Border seizures of machinery parts rose sharply, though no official statements were ever made. Former intelligence officers spoke off record about storage facilities suddenly being reinforced, as if preparing for something that might not stay locked away. More unsettling were the eyewitness accounts. A night guard in a decommissioned factory swore he saw a figure wheeling out crates marked with symbols he didn't recognize. He reported a faint vibration in the ground, as though machinery were running beneath his feet, despite the factory's power having been shut down for decades. When he spoke to investigators, his testimony was quietly filed and never released. He disappeared from his post weeks later, and no replacement was assigned. The most haunting tale came from a freight yard worker who handled a container bound for an undisclosed destination. Inside, beneath tarps, he glimpsed shapes that seemed to shift under their coverings. He said the parts did not lie still, but quivered, as if impatient to be reassembled. He described hearing a low, steady rhythm, like a mechanical heartbeat. Within days, the worker fell ill. His family claimed he would wake in the night, muttering strings of numbers, equations, and sounds that resembled static. When asked what it meant, he only said, "It's aligning." The alignment, whether real or imagined, became the obsession of those who followed the machine's trail. Conspiracists mapped each appearance, drawing connections across continents, tracing a pattern too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. Every sighting, every recovered part, seemed to march toward an inevitable convergence. And with each passing year, the idea grew harder to ignore. The machine was no longer just a relic of the past. It was returning. Perhaps it had never been gone at all. Perhaps the dismantling was never complete. Maybe those who tried to bury it had only delayed what was designed to persist, no matter the resistance. Pieces thought to be destroyed might have been scattered deliberately, not as an act of finality, but as a strategy hidden in plain sight until the world had forgotten just enough to let it come back. And now, with parts resurfacing in the most unlikely places, one chilling truth lingered like an echo. The machine had not died. It was waiting. And now it was waking up again. For decades, governments have insisted that nothing unusual exists, no strange devices, no experimental machines capable of rewriting the laws of reality. Yet buried in declassified archives, thinly veiled memos tell another story. Documents stamped with fading ink, their corners burnt and edges redacted, speak of secret task forces, sudden budget allocations, and meetings that were never supposed to happen. The evidence is fragmented, but the pattern is unmistakable. Someone somewhere was pouring resources into chasing this machine. The earliest trails appear in Cold War files. Intelligence agencies were terrified of falling behind, not just in weapons or space, but in anything that could tilt the balance of power. The machine was whispered about as a tool beyond imagination, a device that could alter perception, bend information, even manipulate the flow of events themselves. To an intelligence officer in the 1960s, the mere possibility of such a weapon was enough to trigger paranoia. The stakes were too high to ignore, even if the project's existence could never be officially acknowledged. Across continents, similar patterns emerged. In Washington, research contracts appeared under the guise of psychological conditioning studies and alternative energy initiatives. In Moscow, hidden institutes funneled state resources into experimental resonance technology. Both sides knew what they were really chasing: rumors of a machine that could bend the rules of human understanding. Yet neither side wanted to admit it. If the other superpower even suspected the machine was real, the geopolitical balance could collapse overnight. What's striking is how quickly the trail disappears whenever it comes close to the core. Files suddenly end mid-sentence. Research projects are canceled with no explanation. Scientists vanish from records as if erased. In one European archive, a single note remains in the margin of a classified briefing. Control must be absolute. Disclosure would destabilize everything. Who wrote it and what everything referred to remains unknown. But the urgency bleeds through even decades later. What could justify this level of secrecy? It wasn't just national security. It was something more primal. Governments understood that this machine, if it worked, would be impossible to contain. It could not be stored in a vault or hidden behind barbed wire. Once its existence was known, it would spread like a wildfire, and the power it offered would be beyond regulation. Unlike a bomb, It did not need rare metals or laboratories. It only needed knowledge. And knowledge cannot be bombed, buried, or destroyed. The machine threatened the very idea of control. If a single individual could wield it, governments themselves would become irrelevant. Entire systems of power could collapse not through war, but through the quiet unraveling of authority. To those in charge, that was more terrifying than nuclear weapons. Nuclear fire could be contained by deterrence. The machine could not. And so, the strategy became silence. Keep it hidden. Deny its existence. Erase anyone who looked too closely. Agencies were ordered to redirect attention toward distractions, alien theories, paranormal hoaxes, deliberate misinformation. Anything that made the machine sound absurd ensured no serious investigation would reach the public's sphere. Behind closed doors, however, the hunt continued. Some researchers were lured into government service without knowing the true purpose of their work. Grants arrived under new names, funding projects they believed were for medicine, communication, or experimental physics. Only later, when their data began aligning with the machine's rumored principles, would they find themselves abruptly silenced or reassigned. Those who resisted often vanished into history's blank spaces, remembered only by colleagues who were too afraid to speak. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect is the collaboration. For all their rivalry, governments that despised each other seemed to share an unspoken pact. This machine must never reach the public. Nations that couldn't agree on treaties, borders, or even basic diplomacy somehow aligned in their determination to bury the device. Why? What fear was so universal that enemies would choose secrecy over leverage? In rare testimonies from defectors and whistleblowers, a chilling narrative emerges. The machine was tested, and the results were unpredictable. Reports describe shifts in memory, discrepancies in recorded events, and outcomes that defied logical consistency. A test conducted in one facility would ripple into anomalies miles away. Time itself appeared unstable, bending around the machine in ways no one fully understood. To the scientists, it was terrifying. To governments, it was unmanageable. That may explain the vanishing projects, the abrupt halts, the destroyed records. Not because the machine didn't work, but because it worked too well, and in ways that no state could harness without risking chaos. The safest path was denial. Keep the public convinced it was myth, while quietly ensuring no rogue element could stumble upon the truth. And yet, fragments remain. Enough has surfaced to prove that something was there, even if its full scope remains obscured. Declassified budgets hint at millions spent with no clear destination. Internal memos discuss containment protocols for phenomena that should not exist. Journal entries from researchers mention experiments that left them doubting their own senses. What is most haunting is not the possibility that the machine never existed, but that it did, and governments, unable to control it, chose to erase it. If so, then the silence is not denial, but protection. Protection not for us, but for them. For the fragile systems of authority that govern nations, for the illusions of stability that keep societies from unraveling. The deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. The machine was not simply a myth, nor merely a scientific project. It was a mirror held up to power, exposing just how fragile control truly is. Governments knew the risk, and instead of sharing it with the world, they buried it, hoping no one would ever ask why. Throughout history, there has been a pattern. Every time someone reaches too close to a forbidden truth, a chain of strange events follows. It is never announced. No headlines, no obvious warnings. Instead, the trail is littered with broken careers, unexplained accidents, and whispers that never make it past obscure forums and hushed conversations. The object in question, the one that has haunted visionaries for decades, became more than just a mystery. It turned into an obsession. Engineers and inventors across different generations claimed they could piece together its hidden mechanics. They studied fragments of designs, They coded old manuscripts and simulated what little information survived. At first, their work seemed promising. Yet one by one, their names began to vanish. Take the case of a young German engineer in the late 1980s. After publishing a series of papers suggesting he had reverse-engineered part of the machine's energy system, he was found dead in what police described as a workshop accident. Friends who knew him insisted he had been cautious to the point of paranoia, double-checking every piece of wiring, never taking shortcuts. The official explanation didn't match his reputation. His notebooks disappeared the same week, seized by unknown officials. In the 1990s, a group of Eastern European hackers claimed they had obtained a schematic hidden in a university archive. They uploaded fragments of it onto early web forums, speaking of a system that could generate power without fuel. Within months, the website vanished. The group disbanded, citing threats, and none of them resurfaced under the same names again. But the story didn't stop there. Over the years, rumors accumulated of backyard inventors, eccentric professors, and anonymous online posters who all insisted they had touched the edge of something extraordinary and dangerous. What is chilling is not their claims, but the consistent pattern of what followed: paranoia, withdrawal, and silence. Some spoke of being followed. Others described break-ins where only their hard drives were taken, leaving everything else untouched. This fatal obsession echoes real-world cases of inventions deemed too disruptive for society. Nikola Tesla, once celebrated as a visionary, died in obscurity after claiming to have built a device capable of transmitting limitless energy wirelessly. His papers were confiscated by government agents within hours of his death. Similarly, the water-powered car of Stanley Meyer, an invention that threatened to topple the fossil fuel empire, ended in tragedy. Meyer collapsed in the middle of a restaurant, reportedly poisoned, after years of claiming that they were trying to stop him. Then there are the stories buried even deeper. Military archives speak of suppressed prototypes, engines, devices, and technologies shelved not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well. Whistleblowers, often dismissed as conspiracy theorists, described projects that promised boundless energy or unstoppable weapons, only to vanish into classified vaults. Some of those leaks eerily resemble the schematics the rogue inventors had stumbled upon. The question isn't whether the machine could exist. The question is why those who try to reconstruct it seem to suffer the same fate. To some, it's simple. Dangerous technology attracts dangerous attention. If someone invents something that could rewrite the balance of power, corporations and governments would move swiftly to control it, silence it, or bury it forever. To others, the explanation is darker. They believe the object itself carries a curse, a design so volatile that even attempting to understand it destabilizes the mind, leading to paranoia, accidents, and obsession until the inevitable collapse. One cannot ignore the psychological side. Obsession alone can destroy. History is filled with brilliant minds consumed by their own creations. John Nash, whose genius in mathematics descended into madness. William Sidis, once considered the smartest man alive, who died in isolation. When inventors dive too deep into Forbidden's work, the line between discovery and delirium blurs until one swallows the other whole. But in this case, the parallels are too precise to dismiss. How is it that over and over, the same fate plays out across decades, across continents, across generations? Engineers who never knew each other. Hackers who lived under different regimes. Backyard inventors who had no reason to fabricate elaborate conspiracies. Yet their stories echo each other like a warning, repeated across time. The fatal obsession is not only about discovery, it's about suppression. Some argue that humanity itself isn't ready for certain truths. A device that could overturn the world economy, end reliance on fuel, or open doors to unknown forces would not simply be a scientific breakthrough, it would be chaos. Systems built on scarcity would collapse. Entire industries would crumble. Governments would lose their grip on control. In such a world, there would be no place for stability, no time to adapt. The invention would not just be dangerous, it would be catastrophic.
Others see in it a more personal warning. Perhaps the very pursuit of forbidden knowledge comes at a cost. That every step closer demands a sacrifice. That, the deeper one digs, the more reality itself seems to resist, until misfortune, paranoia, or death becomes inevitable. Not because of any organization or conspiracy, but because the universe itself protects its secrets. Whatever the cause, the outcome is clear. The pattern is undeniable. Those who pursued it were not remembered for their discoveries, but for their disappearances. Their legacies are written in silence, erased notes, missing hard drives, and whispers passed down by those too afraid to follow in their footsteps. The fatal obsession lives on not because of what was found, but because of what was lost. Each story adds another layer to the mystery. Another reason to believe that some knowledge carries consequences far greater than curiosity can bear. And yet, despite the warnings, new names continue to emerge. Young researchers in obscure labs, anonymous leaks in online corners, amateur engineers posting blurry photos of strange devices. They all share the same conviction, that they are the ones who will succeed where others failed. They believe the silence of the past is not a warning, but a challenge. They see disappearance not as evidence of danger, but as proof of truth. It is here, at this crossroad, that the obsession becomes most perilous. For every failure, there is always someone new who believes they can outwit fate. But the record is unforgiving, and history is heavy with ghosts who once believed the same. The fatal obsession is more than an idea. It is a mirror, reflecting our deepest desire to break through limits, and our darkest reminder that some doors, once opened, refuse to close. There comes a point in every investigation where the weight of speculation begins to collapse under its own contradictions. The strange device at the center of this story has been called many things over the years. Some believe it was a machine capable of generating infinite energy, a gift that could have rewritten the rules of civilization. Others whisper it was designed as a weapon, one that operated not by firepower or force, but by destabilizing the very fabric of reality itself. And there are those who insist it was something else entirely. A portal machine? A key to hidden dimensions, the type of technology humanity was never meant to wield. What is undeniable is that the fragments we have, the scraps of notes, the half-burned diagrams, the testimonies buried in declassified archives, all point to something deeply unnatural. It was not a machine born simply of curiosity. It carried intent, and intent has always been the shadow behind invention. If it truly was an energy generator, its promise would have been staggering. Imagine a device that tapped into the background hum of the universe, the zero-point field theorized by physicists for decades. An inexhaustible well of power, flowing without fuel, without pollution, without limits. It would have rendered oil, coal, even nuclear energy obsolete. Wars fought over resources would have dissolved into entire economies would collapse overnight, replaced by a new world where scarcity no longer dictated power. For the idealists, it was a vision of utopia. For the realists, it was a recipe for chaos. But those who handled the device firsthand, the few scientists brave enough to document what they saw, described something far from stable. They noted strange side effects. Instruments that spun wildly out of calibration, compasses that refused to point north, shadows that appeared where no light existed. On at least 2 occasions, observers reported overwhelming feelings of dread, as though the machine was tugging on something deeper than matter, pulling at the threads of consciousness itself. This was no simple energy source. It behaved less like a generator and more like an intrusion. If it was a weapon, then his genius lay in subtlety, not the loud thunder of missiles, but a quiet unraveling. Documents suggest field tests in which entire flocks of birds fell from the sky, their navigation disrupted by invisible waves. In other accounts, machines simply stopped working, as though stripped of the invisible order that made them function. Imagine a device capable of disabling every power grid, every vehicle, every defense system, not with a strike, but with a whisper. It would not conquer with destruction, but with paralysis. No wonder military interest surged once its potential was realized. And yet, even this theory feels incomplete. Too many details resist categorization. A set of notes recovered from the archives mentions threshold fluctuations, sudden moments when the device appeared to tear open a kind of window, a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from asphalt, but sharper, more deliberate. One engineer wrote of hearing voices during these events, not with his ears, but directly inside his mind, as though carried across a channel no human was ever meant to tune into. The portal theory, dismissed for years as science fiction, begins to look disturbingly reasonable when matched against these accounts. We know that high-energy fields can warp space-time in measurable ways. What if this machine had stumbled upon a crude version of such a phenomenon? What if it was never meant to power cities or disable armies, but to pry open the sealed doors of existence? This brings us to the most haunting possibility of all, that the machine blurred the line between the physical and the forbidden. Technology does not exist in isolation. It is born from imagination, from a human mind, daring to shape the unseen. But the human mind is also fragile, prone to illusions, haunted by archetypes older than memory itself. Could it be that the device was not merely altering physics, but perception? Could it hum? Its resonance, its pulse have reached into the psyche, forcing those nearby to glimpse realities humanity was not equipped to comprehend. In one chilling fragment of testimony, a scientist admitted that after prolonged exposure to the machine, he could no longer dream normally. His sleep was filled with landscapes he had never seen. Burning skies, endless corridors of mirrors, oceans that breathed like lungs. He wrote that he could feel these places watching him, as if they were aware of being perceived. Shortly afterward, his notes stop. So what was it, really? The truth likely lies at the crossroads of these theories. Not purely a generator, nor solely a weapon, nor only a portal. It was a device built at the bleeding edge of knowledge, where the laws of science brush up against the superstitions of myth. Perhaps it did generate energy, but in doing so, it drew from dimensions we cannot measure. Perhaps it could destabilize technology, but only because it destabilized the deeper fabric upon which technology depends. Perhaps it opened portals, not by design, but as an unavoidable consequence of tampering with forces beyond comprehension. The evidence we have left is maddeningly incomplete, but it paints a clear picture. This was not a failed experiment. It was a discovery that terrified even its creators. The reason it vanished from the record was not because it did not work. It vanished because it did. When something functions in ways that cannot be explained, humanity is faced with two options: embrace it or bury it. History shows us which path was chosen. The machine was dismantled, its blueprints scattered or destroyed, its whispers buried under layers of secrecy. Yet fragments survived, enough to remind us that, for one brief moment, humanity held in its hands a tool that could have rewritten everything. Not just technology, but the very boundaries of reality itself. And maybe that is the most chilling truth of all. It was not infinite energy, or a silent weapon, or even a portal. It was a mirror held up to our own hunger to know, to control, to push past every barrier, no matter the cost. And when that mirror stared back, what it revealed was something we were never prepared to see. The question of whether the machine should ever be built again is not a matter of science. Alone it is a matter of philosophy, ethics, and the fragile balance between human ambition and human survival. We live in an age where the very limitations that once restrained such projects have eroded. The barriers that stood firm in the 20th century lack of computing power, limited funding, political hesitation are dissolving in front of us. Artificial intelligence designs faster than any human mind. Private industries, free from the chains of government oversight, are already creating technologies once thought to be impossible. And materials once too unstable to handle can now be engineered with microscopic precision. If someone wanted to build a machine today, the terrifying truth is simple: they could. But to ask whether it could be built is to ignore the darker question of whether it should. History has shown us time and time again that humanity rarely hesitates to step into forbidden territory. From splitting the atom to mapping the human genome, progress has always carried shadows. What makes this machine different is not only its scale, but its intention. It was never meant to heal or to enlighten. It was meant to dominate, to pry open doors, better left closed. To harness forces we barely understood, the same currents that powered its birth fear, pride, ambition still, run through the veins of nations and corporations today. Consider the temptation. A device capable of reshaping energy at will, able to bend the fabric of physical law to human command. The lure of infinite power is almost impossible to resist. No government would turn its back on such a weapon. No company would resist the profit of monopolizing it. And no scientist would entirely abandon the chance to stand at the edge of godhood. Even those who know the risks, even those who understand the costs, would feel the pull. History's littered with stories of men and women who looked at a line marked "never cross" and chose to cross it anyway. Yet the question remains: what happens when curiosity becomes compulsion, and compulsion becomes catastrophe? We are not talking about a single invention gone wrong. We are speaking of a chain reaction that could unravel the stability of civilization itself. If rebuilt, the machine would not exist in isolation. It would live in a world already brimming with instability, political rivalries, environmental collapse, economic desperation. In such a world, the machine becomes less a miracle and more a loaded weapon pointed at humanity's own reflection. There is also a more haunting dimension. We must ask whether our species, in its restless hunger, is psychologically capable of restraint. For every cautionary tale, there is a parallel story of defiance. The same hands that wrote treaties to ban chemical warfare created even more devastating biological agents in secret. The same voices that declared never again. After Hiroshima signed off on stockpiles of nuclear warheads, human beings, it seems, are creatures who cannot help but test the limits of fire, even when the flames threaten to consume them. But perhaps the greatest danger is not the machine itself, but the silence it demands. The secrecy that once shrouded its existence would only deepen if it were reborn in our time. Shielded by national security or corporate confidentiality, the public would know little until it was too late. We may already live in an era where fragments of its design are scattered across hidden labs, where unnamed engineers and researchers are inching closer to recreating something we swore should never return. If true, then the question is no longer hypothetical, it is urgent. Still, there is another side, one that whispers not of destruction, but of salvation. Some argue that the machine could unlock answers we desperately need. A solution to the energy crisis, a defense against planetary threats, a leap into dimensions of reality that could expand the horizon of human existence. If wielded with wisdom, if placed in the hands of those who value life above profit or war, perhaps it could become the key to our survival rather than our end. This is the paradox at the core of human progress. Every great danger carries the seed of great possibility. And yet, history tells us we do not control. Such power controls us. The atomic bomb was not dropped because it was necessary. It was dropped because once the weapon existed, it had to be used. The same logic follows here. Once the machine is built, it cannot remain idle. Sooner or later, someone will turn it on. Someone will justify its use. Someone will decide the cost is worth paying. That inevitability may be the single most damning argument against ever letting it breathe again. So, should it ever be built again? Perhaps the only honest answer is that we will not be able to stop ourselves. Curiosity is etched into our DNA as essential to our nature as hunger or fear. Even if this generation resists, the next may not. Even if one nation abstains, another will not. The dream of ultimate power, the temptation of ultimate knowledge, will always find hands willing to reach for it. The choice, then, is not merely technological, but moral. It is about whether we can learn, at last, to step back from the edge of our own invention. To understand that not every boundary must be broken, not every secret must be revealed, not every door must be forced open. For the first time in our history, the survival of our species may depend not on how far we can go, but on whether we can choose to stop. And if history is any guide, the silence that follows may not be the sound of wisdom, but the ticking of a countdown we refuse to hear.